Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. It was late autumn when Mark and his wife Laura decided to go RV camping. They'd been working non-stop for months, and they thought a quiet weekend away in the woods would give them a chance to unwind. The spot they chose was remote but highly recommended by a friend, a serene, secluded forest area near a small lake. The perfect place to disconnect from the world. They arrived late in the afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows as they set up their RV. The trees around them, still clinging to their golden leaves, creaked with the wind, but there was a certain calmness that came with being in nature, far from the bustling city life. By the time night fell, they were cozy inside, enjoying a quiet dinner, the flicker of their campfire casting soft glows on the RV walls. After dinner, Mark went outside to gather more wood for the fire. Laura stayed inside reading a book. The wind had picked up a little, but there was still no sign of the storm the weather reports had predicted. It wasn't until Mark had gone to the edge of the clearing to collect the last of the firewood that he noticed something odd. The air around him seemed to grow unnaturally still. The rustling of the leaves had stopped. A shiver ran down his spine as he scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the reach of the campfire's glow. But there was nothing. He returned quickly to the RV, brushing off the unease that had started to grow in him. Laura had finished her book and was now preparing for bed. They exchanged a few words about the quiet, peaceful night before settling into their separate bunks. But as the hours dragged on, Mark found sleep elusive. The silence outside, which had seemed peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive. He tossed and turned, listening to the occasional snap of a twig or the low call of a distant animal. Every now and then he thought he heard something, the faintest sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. It could have been the wind, he told himself, or maybe just a nocturnal creature passing by. Around 3 a.m., Mark was finally about to drift off when there came a knock on the RV door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but persistent. His heart raced as he slowly climbed out of bed, unsure who would be out there in the dead of night. He looked over at Laura, who was still sound asleep. Another knock, louder this time. Mark approached the door cautiously, peering through the small window beside it. There was no one. Just the dark, empty woods surrounding them. His pulse quickened and he opened the door slowly, scanning the area. There was still no sign of anyone, just the faint rustling of branches in the breeze. Mark stepped outside, looking around the clearing, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. He told himself it was probably some prankster or a neighbor camper, but as he turned back to the RV, something caught his eye, a figure moving between the trees at the edge of the campsite. It was just a shadow at first, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out the outline of a person, tall, hunched, almost like they were crouching. Mark froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure seemed to be watching him, unmoving, its face obscured by the dark. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice shaky, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. Slowly, Mark backed up toward the door of the RV, his mind racing. He reached for the handle, never taking his eyes off the shadow. And then, without warning, the figure darted into the trees, disappearing from sight. Mark rushed back inside, locking the door behind him. His mind was spinning, the encounter feeling all too real. He glanced at Laura, still asleep, oblivious to the strange events unfolding just outside. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the woods. The peaceful solitude they'd hoped for had been replaced with an eerie sense of dread. He stayed up the rest of the night, listening intently to every sound outside, but nothing more happened. When the sun finally rose, Mark tried to convince himself that it had just been his imagination or a trick of the shadows. But as they packed up to leave, he noticed something chilling, muddy footprints leading away from the RV, disappearing into the woods. That was the moment Mark realized that the man he'd seen wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Whoever it was had been watching them, waiting for the right moment. And then, as they drove away, something even more unsettling struck him. They hadn't heard a single vehicle on the road leading in or out of the camping area. In fact, they hadn't seen a soul all weekend. No campers. No rangers. It was as if the whole forest had been empty except for them. And the man who had been hiding in the trees. Mark and Laura never went RV camping in the woods again. And every time they passed a secluded forest area on a road trip, they couldn't help but glance nervously toward the trees, wondering if the shadow was still out there waiting. Months had passed since Mark and Laura's unsettling experience, and although they tried to put it behind them, the memories lingered. Every time they went for a walk in the woods or even passed a wooded area while driving, a chill would crawl down their spines. Mark couldn't help but replay the image of that figure in his mind, the way it crouched, the way it watched him without a word, the way it seemed to disappear into the darkness so effortlessly. One evening, while Mark was scrolling through an online camping forum, he stumbled upon a thread that made his blood run cold. The title read, "RV Campers in the Northwoods Missing Person Mystery." Curious, he clicked on the post. It described a series of strange disappearances that had occurred over the past few years in various remote camping sites in the same forest area where Mark and Laura had camped. The posts were filled with accounts of eerie figures seen at night, strange noises heard just outside RVs, and campers who woke up to find their belongings moved or the locks on their doors tampered with. But the most disturbing detail was that in each case, the victims' RVs were found abandoned, with no signs of struggle, just a trail of footprints leading into the woods, often disappearing completely. Mark's stomach twisted as he read on. The forum thread had been started by someone who claimed to have survived a similar encounter. The person detailed how they had gone camping with their family, only to have their RV broken into during the night. The intruder, a man with a grotesque, wild look in his eyes, had somehow snuck into their RV without them hearing a thing. The family had escaped, but they too found only muddy footprints leading away from their campsite. The final post on the thread was the most chilling. "I don't think the man is a man at all. He's something else. Something that lives in the woods, watching us when we come too close. Be careful when you camp in the Northwoods. You're not alone even if you think you are." Mark's heart raced. He immediately showed Laura the thread, and they both sat in silence afterward, the gravity of the situation sinking in. They had never believed in the supernatural, but what they had experienced felt far beyond a coincidence. It wasn't just a shadow in the trees, it was something that had been watching them, tracking them. A few days later, Mark received an email from the campsite where they had stayed. It was an update from the owners who were informing all past visitors that the area had recently been shut down due to security concerns and unexplained incidents. No further details were given, but the tone of the message was enough to send another wave of unease through Mark. They thought about going back to the site to investigate, but something inside Mark knew better. They had already brushed with something far darker than they could comprehend. But that gnawing curiosity, the desire to find out who or what had been watching them remained. Then one evening Laura suggested they visit a nearby small town and speak with some locals who had lived in the area for decades. Perhaps they would know more about the strange occurrences and the mysterious figure in the woods. Against his better judgment, Mark agreed. The old town was quiet, its streets lined with small shops and homes that looked as though they hadn't changed in years. They made their way to a cafe where an elderly man named Thomas had been sitting alone, reading the newspaper. When they asked him about the forest and the disappearances, his face grew pale. "I've lived here all my life," he said in a low voice. "People always talk about the woods, the strange things that happen out there. Folks from around here. We don't go near the Northwoods after dark. The man or whatever it is has been around for decades. I remember hearing stories when I was a boy. People disappearing and sometimes their RVs or cars would be found abandoned like you said. No signs of struggle. Just empty. And a trail of muddy footprints leading away from the site." He paused, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "You should have never gone out there. No one does unless they have to," he added in a whisper. "You want to know more? You're going to have to go ask him yourself." Mark and Laura exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could ask more, Thomas stood up abruptly and left the cafe. They didn't see him again, and after that they never spoke about it again. But deep inside Mark knew the truth. Whatever had been watching them in those woods hadn't disappeared. It was still there waiting, and the longer they tried to ignore it, the closer it would get. A year later, Mark decided to return to the Northwoods, this time without Laura. His desire to know the truth outweighed his fear. He took the RV back to the same site where they had camped before, parked it, and sat in the stillness of the night, watching the shadows stretch long across the forest floor. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe a glimpse of the figure again or maybe something else entirely. But nothing happened. Hours passed. Then just before dawn Mark saw it. A shadow moving in the trees, not a human figure but something far darker. It wasn't stalking him though. It was standing there in plain sight. Watching. For the first time Mark realized the truth. It wasn't just a man. It wasn't just a person hiding in the woods. It was something much older, something that had always been there. And it was waiting for anyone foolish enough to venture too deep. Mark froze, his body stiff with fear as he stared at the shadow standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching him. His heart pounded in his chest and for a moment he thought about turning and running back to the RV. But deep down he knew that would be pointless. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't interested in chasing him, it was content just watching, waiting for him to make the next move. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow and fast. The figure remained motionless, but Mark felt a deep, primal fear rising within him. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn back and never return to these woods. But curiosity, something he hadn't felt in years, pushed him forward. Another step. The shadow twitched, a subtle movement. Mark's pulse raced, and his eyes widened as he realized that it wasn't just a shadow, it was something else entirely. It had form but no real shape. Like smoke or mist, it seemed to shift, melting into the trees and then reforming. Mark's legs nearly gave out beneath him, but he forced himself to stay standing. "Who are you?" Mark whispered, his voice shaky but determined. There was no answer. But Mark could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on him. It wasn't just watching him, it was inside his head now, whispering to him, trying to get under his skin. His thoughts started to blur and a cold, gnawing dread overtook him. It felt as if the forest itself had come alive, the trees bending, the wind carrying whispers that didn't make sense. Suddenly, a loud crack of a branch broke the silence. Mark whipped around, expecting to see something, but the clearing was empty again, the shadow gone. The cold sweat on his brow didn't go away, and his heartbeat was deafening in the quiet morning air. He ran back to the RV as quickly as he could, locking the door behind him. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, and his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He knew now that the thing in the woods wasn't something he could face. It wasn't just a man or a creature, it was a presence, a force tied to the land itself, perhaps even older than the forest. There were no answers here. Only more questions. More fear. More silence. For the next few hours Mark didn't dare leave the RV. He sat in the dim light, staring out through the windows, watching the trees sway in the wind. Nothing moved. No shadows. No figures. But he could feel it, the eyes watching him from the distance, just beyond the trees, waiting for him to make the mistake of stepping outside again. As the sun began to rise, Mark made the decision. It was time to go. He couldn't stay here any longer. He didn't care what he had learned or what he still needed to uncover. The forest was alive and it didn't want him there. With shaky hands he started the RV, the engine roaring to life as he pulled away from the site. He didn't look back. But even as he drove down the winding road, heading far away from the Northwoods, he couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that something was following him, something that had never really left the woods. And deep down he knew that wherever he went, the shadow would always be there, lurking in the trees, waiting for the next camper. The next curious soul to venture too close to the dark heart of the forest. Mark never returned to the Northwoods again. But the memories, the chilling realization of what he had encountered, stayed with him forever. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind howled just a little too fiercely outside, Mark would still feel that presence, as if the shadow had followed him, never truly letting him go. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Emma and her best friend Sarah had been planning the trip for months, just two women, an RV and the great outdoors. They wanted to escape the stress of their busy lives, relax by the lake, and enjoy the solitude of the forest. They had heard about a secluded campground deep in the woods, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, but the excitement of being in nature kept their spirits high. They finally arrived at the campground just as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the treetops. They set up the RV in a quiet corner of the site, surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and fresh, the kind of evening breeze that carried the scent of pine and earth. They opened a bottle of wine, chatted, and cooked a simple dinner on the small stove. As night fell, the forest around them grew darker, the stars above shining like diamonds in the sky. They lit a small fire outside, the crackling flames casting long shadows on the ground. The warmth from the fire was comforting, but there was something unnerving about the stillness of the forest. No animals were stirring, no sounds of the usual nighttime creatures. Just silence. "That's weird," Sarah remarked, glancing around. "I haven't heard a single animal since we got here." Emma shrugged it off. "Maybe they're all hiding. It's cold tonight." But as the hours passed, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The silence was almost oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The wind had died down completely and the air was still. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Around midnight, Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, which was located a short walk away at the edge of the campground. Emma stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm the growing anxiety in her chest. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. "Sarah?" Emma called out, expecting her friend to be back. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were slow, deliberate, as if the person was walking with purpose. Emma turned around, but there was no one there. Her heart skipped a beat and she stood up, peering into the dark forest. She didn't see anything, just the black shadows between the trees. "Sarah?" she called again, but this time her voice trembled. Still no answer. She felt a surge of panic. What was going on? She grabbed her phone and tried calling Sarah, but there was no signal. The campground was far enough into the woods that reception was spotty, but this was different. It felt as if the air had shifted, the pressure around her increasing, making it hard to breathe. Moments later, Sarah appeared, walking briskly toward the RV. "What happened?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know. I swear I heard someone following me," Sarah said, her eyes wide with fear. "I turned around and there was a man standing just at the edge of the trees. I don't know how long he'd been there, but he just stared at me and then he disappeared." Emma's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "I don't know him. He was there 1 second and then gone the next," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I didn't know what to do, so I just ran back here." They both stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling faintly in the background. Emma felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was just someone camping nearby, Emma suggested, but even she didn't believe her own words. But Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so. I felt like he was watching me. Like he was waiting for me to be alone." They decided to lock the RV doors and try to sleep, but neither of them could relax. Every creak of the RV, every snap of a branch outside made them jump. Emma kept glancing out the small windows, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the light of the fire. Around 2 a.m., Emma was woken by a loud thump on the RV's side. Her heart leaped into her throat as she sat up in bed, straining to hear. It came again, a slow, deliberate knock, as if someone was trying to get their attention. Sarah, already awake, grabbed Emma's arm. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "Yeah," Emma said, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's good." The knocking continued for several minutes, then abruptly stopped. Emma and Sarah stayed completely still, barely breathing, until the sound faded into the distance. Neither of them dared move, afraid of what might happen next. By the time morning came, they were both exhausted, barely able to keep their eyes open. They decided to leave the campground early, no longer caring about the relaxing weekend they had planned. As they packed up, Emma noticed something that made her stomach churn. There were footprints around the RV, not animal tracks, but human footprints, large and deep, as if someone had been walking around their campsite in the night. The tracks led into the trees and disappeared into the woods, just like Sarah had said. As they drove away from the campground, they looked back, but there was no sign of anyone. The woods were silent once again, as if nothing had happened. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had been watching them, the man who had been following Sarah, was still out there, waiting for his next target. Later, when they returned to the city, Emma researched the area online and found disturbing reports from other campers, women who had gone missing in the same woods over the past several years. They weren't just lost. They were hunted. And each time, The trail of their disappearance had led back to that same secluded campground. But the most chilling detail was that none of the women were ever found. Their bodies were never recovered. And Emma realized, with a sickening certainty, that they had come dangerously close to becoming another story. Another disappearance. Another tragedy hidden deep in the woods. And no one would have ever known who was hunting them or why. The weeks that followed their unsettling experience in the woods were filled with unease. Emma and Sarah tried to return to their normal lives, but the lingering fear never fully left them. Every time they closed their eyes, they could still see the shadow of the man standing at the edge of the trees watching them. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, somewhere, that they hadn't truly escaped. Emma's thoughts would drift back to the footprints she had seen around their RV, the deep, deliberate marks left in the dirt. Whoever had been out there had been waiting for them. Watching. And then, like the predator he was, he'd slipped back into the woods without a trace, leaving only his eerie presence behind. But it wasn't just the fear of the man that haunted Emma. It was the realization that there were more victims out there, women who had disappeared, never to be seen again. The more she researched, the more she uncovered. The disappearances spanned years and no one seemed to have any answers. Some authorities suspected a serial killer, but there was never enough evidence to make a solid case. The woods were vast, and the secluded campgrounds were easy to access and just as easy to disappear from. One evening, Emma received an unexpected message from an anonymous account. It was a simple text, "I know what happened to you." Her heart raced as she read the words. Who could this be? How did they know? She immediately showed Sarah, who was equally unnerved by the message. The next few days were a blur of unanswered calls and strange, cryptic messages. Each one seemed to know more about their experience than they should have, details only the two of them knew. The footprints. The knock on the RV. The fear that had gripped them. It was as if someone had been following them, even after they left the campground. Emma was terrified. They had tried to forget, to move on, but it was clear now that the man who had been hunting them wasn't finished with them. He knew who they were. He had been watching them long before that night in the woods. And now he was getting closer. One night, after yet another unsettling message, Sarah suggested they go to the police. Emma hesitated, torn between wanting to seek help and knowing how little the authorities had been able to do for the other women who had gone missing. But something had to be done. They couldn't just sit back and wait for this man to make his move. They met with Detective Harper, a seasoned officer who had worked on the cold cases of missing women from the area for years. After hearing their story, Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "You're not the first to come to us with something like this," he said, his voice low. "But we haven't been able to make any progress. It's always the same. The women disappear, their RVs or cars left behind, no signs of struggle. And those footprints. They always lead back into the woods." Emma's blood ran cold at the mention of the footprints. Harper continued, his eyes narrowed. "We've got a theory," he said, leaning forward. "We believe the man you encountered is someone who's been using the campgrounds to lure victims. He knows the area well and he knows how to remain undetected. But we haven't been able to catch him. We don't even have a solid suspect." Emma looked at Sarah, who was staring at Harper in disbelief. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. Harper's face softened for a moment. "Stay vigilant. Don't go back to those woods. We'll keep an eye out, but you need to stay away from that campground. We don't know how many victims there are, but we suspect it's more than we realize." It was then that Emma realized the chilling truth. The man hadn't just been hunting women for months. He had been doing it for years. And he was getting closer. The more they tried to move on, the more he seemed to follow them. There was no escaping him. Over the next few weeks, Emma's life became a blur of paranoia and fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every car that passed by her house, every shadow in the corner of her eye, made her heart race. And Sarah felt it too. The isolation, the dread, the sense that something terrible was just around the corner. One night, after a long day at work, Emma returned home to find a message waiting for her on her doorstep. It was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. Her hands shook as she opened it, reading the words. "I see you're still afraid. You can run, but you'll never escape me. I've been waiting for you to come back. I know where you are." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her worst fear had come true. The man was still watching. He knew where she lived. He was closer than ever. She called Sarah immediately, but there was no answer. Panic set in as she dialed again and again and again. Still nothing. Emma's heart pounded as she rushed to Sarah's apartment. It was late and the streets were eerily empty. She arrived to find Sarah's door ajar, the lock broken. Panic gripped her chest as she rushed inside, calling Sarah's name. The apartment was dark, the only sound her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Then she found it. A message scrawled on the wall in red. "I told you I've been waiting." But Sarah was nowhere to be found. And Emma knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that the nightmare was far from over. Emma's hands trembled as she backed out of the apartment, her mind spinning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. Sarah was gone. The fear that had been building in her for weeks now consumed her. She rushed back to her car, dialing the police as she drove, but the call went straight to voicemail. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. The man had taken Sarah, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he had both of them. Her mind raced, replaying everything that had happened, the footsteps in the woods, the messages, the feeling of being hunted. She tried to focus, to think of anything that could lead her to Sarah. And then, like a jolt of electricity, a thought hit her. The campground. The place where it all started. Emma slammed on the brakes, her heart racing. She hadn't considered it before, but now it was the only place that made sense. The man knew they had been there. He'd been watching them, and now he had taken Sarah. She had to go back. She had to confront him. As she drove toward the woods, the familiar landscape of the forest loomed ahead. The place where she and Sarah had spent what seemed like a lifetime ago, enjoying the peace, the silence, the stillness of the trees. But now it felt like a graveyard. A place where nightmares had taken root. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road. As Emma entered the campground, her headlights illuminated the worn sign that marked the entrance. The air felt thick with the same tension she had felt that night, the same sense of wrongness. She parked the car a few yards from the old RV site, clutching the flashlight in her hand as she stepped out. Her pulse quickened with every step, the fear growing more intense. She tried calling Sarah's phone again. No answer. The silence around her was deafening. Emma walked to the spot where their RV had been parked, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign, any clue that might lead her to Sarah. As she moved through the site, she noticed something odd. A trail of fresh footprints in the dirt, leading deeper into the woods. They were large, heavy footprints, and they were too precise to be random. The trail was deliberate, methodical. Whoever had made them knew exactly where they were going. With shaky breath, Emma followed the trail, stepping cautiously but with urgency. The deeper she went, the darker it became, the trees closing in around her. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the occasional rustle of the wind. But it felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond a thick row of trees, there was an abandoned cabin. It looked dilapidated, its windows shattered, its door hanging loosely from its hinges. It was a place that hadn't seen life in years, but Emma's instincts told her it was exactly where she needed to be. Without hesitation, she approached the cabin, her heart pounding louder with each step. She moved cautiously, peering through the broken windows, but the inside was empty. Nothing but dust and debris. Then she heard something. A faint, muffled sound. A voice. It was Sarah's voice. Emma rushed to the door, throwing it open with a force that made the hinges creak. Inside, the air was thick with stale, musty smells. The only light came from a small crack in the wall, illuminating a dark corner. And there, in that corner, was Sarah. Her hands were tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear but alive. "Sarah!" Emma cried, rushing over to her friend. She started to untie the ropes, her hands trembling as she worked quickly. Sarah gasped as soon as she was free, her body sagging against Emma for support. He said. He said he was watching you. Watching us both." Emma's mind raced. The man had been planning this for longer than she could have imagined. She had walked right into his trap. Before she could respond, a shadow moved across the doorway. Emma froze, her blood running cold. The man was here. He had been waiting. Watching. He stepped into the cabin, his face half covered by a dark mask. His eyes gleamed with malice as he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots crunching on the wooden floor. He had a knife in his hand, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "I told you I've been waiting," he said, his voice low and taunting. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stood between Sarah and the man. She had to think fast. She had to get them both out of there. There was no way she was going to let him take Sarah again. Without warning, Emma lunged for the knife that was lying on the floor. The man moved to stop her, but she was faster. She grabbed the handle, spun around, and faced him, her breath shallow and fast. The man smirked, unfazed. "You think you can stop me?" But Emma's fear was replaced with pure, raw determination. She wasn't going to let him win. Not again. With a swift motion, she lunged at him, the knife in her hand. He tried to block her, but she was quick. The blade connected, and for the first time the man staggered back, a sharp cry escaping his lips. He seemed to lose his confidence in that moment, his arrogance faltering. Emma took advantage of his hesitation, pushing him down and pinning him against the floor. She kept the knife close, her body trembling but her resolve unwavering. "Don't come any closer," she warned, her voice shaking but firm. "If you even think about moving again, I will make sure you never hurt anyone ever again." The man's eyes flickered with panic, but it was too late. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Emma had called the police as soon as she found Sarah, and they had arrived just in time. The man was arrested, his mask removed to reveal a face she almost didn't recognize. But as the authorities led him away in handcuffs, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just one man. He was a symbol of something darker, something that could never be fully erased. The nightmare was over, but Emma and Sarah knew they would never forget the fear they had faced in the woods. They had survived. But the forest would always hold the memory of the man who hunted them. And no matter how far they ran, they would never forget what it felt like to be prey in the woods. As the police led the man away, his hands bound tightly behind his back, Emma and Sarah stood in the cold night air, the weight of what had happened settling on them. The flashing lights of the squad cars reflected in the trees, casting eerie shadows over the scene. It was over. But somehow the forest still felt like it was holding its breath, like the darkness had not fully released its grip on them. The officers took statements, and for a moment, Emma and Sarah exchanged a quiet, knowing glance. They had survived. They had faced the worst, and yet the forest's grip on them remained. Emma felt exhausted, physically drained, mentally shattered. They had been lucky, so much more fortunate than the other women who had never been found, whose names would remain lost in the woods. But for Emma that didn't make it easier. The knowledge that they were only a hair's breadth from becoming another tragedy haunted her. As the night wore on, and the police finished their investigation, Emma and Sarah were escorted back to their car. The woods were still silent, but the haunting feeling lingered. They knew they could never return to those places again, never camp again in those secluded, quiet forests. The memories of those footprints, the feeling of being hunted, would forever stay with them. On the drive home, neither of them said much. The sounds of the tires on the road felt almost like a drumbeat, the steady rhythm of reality settling back in. Emma kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone there. But the road behind them was empty, just the dark stretch of asphalt leading them away from the nightmare they had barely escaped. When they finally arrived at Sarah's apartment, Emma felt the overwhelming weight of the night lift off her shoulders. But she knew they would both need time. Time to heal, time to move past what they had experienced, and maybe, just maybe, time to feel safe again. The man, once just a shadow in the trees, would face his justice. But Emma knew that in the depths of the woods, in those quiet places where the world seemed to stop, there would always be remnants of what they had gone through. A part of them would always be connected to the fear, to the sense of being hunted. They had escaped, but the woods would never let them forget. As Emma left Sarah's apartment that night, she looked one last time at the darkened sky above the city. Somewhere out there, in the vastness of the wilderness, there were still dark corners where nightmares waited, and not everyone was lucky enough to escape. And so, as she drove home alone, Emma whispered a quiet prayer to herself, a wish for peace. For herself. For Sarah. For every woman who had been lost. And for those who still might be lurking in the shadows, waiting. But for now at least they were free.